Presenting now is Aaron Rosenberg. He is Professor Investigador Titular, full professor, in the Centro de Estudios de Asia y África at El Colegio de Mexico, where he teaches African and comparative literatures. He has published on African song and literature in Research in African Literatures, Wasafiri, the Journal of African Cultural Studies, the Journal of the African Literature Association, and Estudios de Asia y África, among other journals. His book, The Face of Infinity, Popular Representations of Death in Africa and Mexico, exploring inherent hypertextual links between narrative and visual art in Mexican and African contexts, and their implications for the study of organic philosophy, is presently under draft preparation. He will be presenting Blown Away, Louis Armstrong's and Hugh Masekela's ambiguous relation to Africa.
Okay, so Louis Armstrong and Hugh Masekela represent crucial figures in the development of musical and literary cultural traditions through their songs and public personas and commentaries during the 20th century and beyond. Both of these trumpet players, vocalists, express ambiguous and at times problematic relations with Africa as an autochthonous geo-cultural space, which is perceived to be distinct from generalized Western, for example, contemporary or modern systems of ethos. Through a contrastive comparative approach, this paper will analyze the ways in which these artists work through complex layers of isolation and intimacy regarding African realities, imagined and empirical. These phenomena, filtered through experiences of forced migrations and cultural permutations due to political exile and the legacies of slavery, are given form as social acts grappling with the rarefication and debasement of Africans and their cultural expressions as both primitive and inscrutable. This research considers those insights about the nature of putatively African cultural and social associations, which both artists realize, and will allow us to formulate responses to the following questions. What is the nature of the relations with Africa which Armstrong and Masekela express through their songs and public activities? How specifically does Africa, as an apparently distinct mass of geocultural phenomena, simultaneously tied up in traditional and modern cultural trends, figure into their oeuvre? Finally, in what way do the exigencies of popular music as sociocultural action and artefact impact upon the extent and characteristics of these artists' involvement with Africa? In order to respond to these queries, the study will look at the conscious efforts of these artists to both define and distinguish their artistry and public personas from mainstream sociocultural normativities and artistic productivities, at the same time as they embrace oftentimes reductive and potentially offensive enactments and embodiments of Africanness, which illuminate the intricacies of their participation within global systems of performative musical exchange. Recognizing the limitations of a single academic paper, we will limit ourselves to a small selection of elements from what can be described as early points in the career of each artist, and then later in their career, which demonstrate a negotiation, albeit problematic in various ways, of their Africanness. In the case of Louis Armstrong, we will be looking at and listening to the short film Rhapsody in Black and Blue, which was released at the height of Jim Crow in 1932, in counterpoint with his version of the South African song Skokian, released in 1954, and an assortment of his commentaries related to his State Department trips to African countries, specifically his trips to Ghana, first as the Gold Coast in 1956, and then following Ghana's independence in 1960. Hugh Masekela's visual, musical, and rhetorical representations of Africanness in both his own personal and musical case, as well as in a more generalized sense, will be studied through his early album release, Trumpet African, and the somewhat later Americanization of Uga Uga, which was released in 1962 and 1966, respectively, at the height of the apartheid system of South African repression, which demonstrate a concentrated attempt on Masekela's part to map out a sort of third path for himself, synchronizing both his South African and American jazz influences. These early ambiguities with relation to African forms of authenticity will be considered alongside the artist's growing awareness of the deliberate erasure of African forms of cultural knowledge and expression, and his eventual direct involvement in forms of activism, which sought to advocate for both political and social cultural liberation of African communities in South Africa and elsewhere. As will be demonstrated here in the case of both Armstrong and Masekela, their negotiation with their African identities played out in a variety of complex ways, but did not in either case lead them to artistic choices which were founded upon what could be called authentically African autochthonous expressions. While both artists certainly differ in crucial ways as to their relation to Africa exerted upon them and their art due to the roots within putatively African and even reductively traditional forms of knowledge. This is particularly relevant considering the fact that despite growing up in different physical environments, both men were forced to contend with oppressive, highly racialized institutional forms of discrimination. Of overlap between the Jim Crow and apartheid periods, as well as in the lives of Masekela and Armstrong, both of whom were active in the middle decades of the 20th century. And if Masekela's remembrances are to be believed, they were well aware of one another. According to Masekela, one of his earliest trumpets, and the one which he brought to New York, was an instrument gifted to him by Armstrong through Father Huddleston, an important figure in Masekela's initial development. In a brief encapsulated form, we can fruitfully argue that both artists went through an evolutionary process with relation to Africa and authentic Africanness as deployable concepts in their life and work. There is a risk of oversimplifying these complex artistic, intellectual, and aesthetic processes in the interest of explanation. But a summary of these positions provides us with an initial inroads into the rich work of each of these figures. In the initial phase of his career, it seems that Armstrong participated in the same romanticized primitivism and reductive commodification of Africanness, which was part and parcel of the revalorization of Africa as a cultural reference point for diasporic Africans in the Americas during the period of the Harlem Renaissance, a cultural movement which Armstrong was both shaped by and fundamental in establishing and nurturing. As time went on and Armstrong had increasing contact with African people and realities, he began to express a more complex and multifaceted connection with his Africanism, although these newfound feelings of his links to Africa were not reflected in any explicit turn to African music in contradistinction to the hot jazz, which he had been playing for more than 30 years. His recording of the Zimbabwean hit Skokian by Agus Musarurwa in the first half of the 1950s and released in 1954, popularized the song in the United States, but also added a stereotypically primitivist lyric to what had initially been a purely instrumental dance number, thus reducing Africa once again to a land of, and I'm quoting the lyrics here, jungle bungalows and strumming natives. It was only after his later trips to Africa that Armstrong would begin to express his notion of a more profound connection to his Africanness. It is here where we need to consider another aspect of Armstrong's work, in this case as a public intellectual rather than musician. As observed by numerous of his biographers, early on in his career, Armstrong began to become preoccupied with his legacy and the way in which he would be remembered and represented. As a result, he set about recording his thoughts both on reel-to-reel tapes and in written accounts. It is here rather than in his music where Armstrong expressed a sense of closeness which he felt to African people and environments, particularly to those he met in Ghana on his trips. At one point, it is reported that at one of his concerts, Armstrong was struck by the resemblance of a female dancer to his mother and said, "I know it now. I came from here, way back. At least my people did. Now I know this is my country too." These observations, together with the experience which he had in countries such as the Democratic Republic of the Congo, made him more aware of the complexity of African realities and of his possible role in exacerbating or alleviating the problems which Africans were subjected to. Hugh Masekela likewise went on through a number of stages in his development of a utilitarian relationship to his Africanness. At the midpoint of his career, 1978, and in collaboration with his American trumpeter friend Herb Alpert, Hugh Masekela, like Armstrong, also released a version of the song Skokian, In his case, a disco-inflected song with a brief chorus in an African language or languages, which I have not yet been able to identify definitively as Isizulu, Soto, or Xhosa. Based on his own and other commentaries, Masekela started out his career as a young trumpeter in South Africa, emulating African American jazz musicians. And when he arrived in New York in 1960, he initially aspired to fit himself somewhat seamlessly into the jazz scene there. Numerous African American musicians, Miles Davis among them, purportedly advised Masekela to forget such assimilationist aspirations and to search for his own unique voice as an African exile rather than an African American. The initial result of this recommendation was the relatively little known album Trumpet African, which was released in 1962, which contained a variety of songs, including the cliched tunes such as Whim Away and the Click Song, with a tinny and heavily orchestrated production quality. The visual and sonic presentation of himself, which Masekela put together for his 1965 album, The Americanization of Ooga Booga, which I'm showing you here, is based on a live recording, is vastly different from that of Trumpet African. Although the songs are almost exclusively South African and carry titles in South African languages, together with their English translations. The quartet style and the overt demonstration of his assimilation of the techniques of artists such as Freddie Hubbard and John Coltrane make this album a much more profound and honest expression of his musical genius. Just as importantly, however, the album's cover image represents a complex tongue-in-cheek challenge to the music industry's attempt to pigeonhole him as an African artist. The staged photograph is saturated with ironic symbolism, which draws upon traditions of portraiture in South Africa. We can see, for example, a description of this in Athol Fugard and John Connie and Winston Shona's dramatic work, Sizwe Banse is Dead, for a dramatic explanation of these symbolic acts and artifacts. Elsewhere, we can also perceive in this image the racist colonial legacies of processes such as apartheid, slavery, and Jim Crow at work. On the cover, Masekela stares directly at the camera with a confrontational look, communicating distaste and disdain. He is dressed in the typically dapper fashion of a young 1960s office worker, in a mod suit with a thin tie, a briefcase, and what looks to be a Homburg dress hat. The only element conspicuously absent here are the dress shoes and socks, which Masekela has left off in order to emphasize the fact, at least in the eyes of the American public, he is unable to assimilate to American systems of thought and expression. This unassimilable Africanness is emphasized by the lush vegetation, which seems to explode all around the static figure, and which forces him back into the world of some sort of noble musical savage, rather than the profound and articulate artist which he already was at the time. Over the course of his 3 decades of exile, Masekela was able, time and again, to interrogate the problematics of his position as a South African musician performing on the world stage. To make his experiences as an African person relevant to audiences from many walks of life. His greatest successes, however, I would argue, are precisely the songs which do not rely upon what could be called traditional African peoples, which were a part of everyday experience. These men and their families suffered at the hands of apartheid authorities. The appeal of the song comes in great part from the manner in which it manages to sing eloquently and compellingly of the lived experience and sentimental weight of African people's everyday encounters with the world. Masekela unflinchingly dissects the crude realities of these people's lives in order to craft a musical and lyrical work capable of grappling with the contemporary lives of African people and all of their complexity. In a recent interview with Sowetan trumpeter Mandla Mlangeni, I asked him about the use of putatively traditional African elements in his music. And he explained that, and here I'm going to quote him briefly. Instead of being an African, I'm interested in finding humanity and how I relate to the world. You can be proud of your culture and of your heritage. That's fine. But maybe I grew up in a time when those kind of things were used to divide us as a people. I also don't perform my ethnicity. A lot of this ethnic musical practice is performative. It's also how you create a brand. I don't need to perform my Africanity. I think the performance of Zuluness, the performance of being Sutu or Tsonga or Venda is a bit outdated for me personally. I think there needs to be other ways of bringing consciousness. Yes, spirituality is very important, but you also have other pending issues that you also need to address. In this brief exploration of the art and artistry of Louis Armstrong and Hugh Masekela, we have been able to detect in both of their creative trajectories a contention with the realities and symbolic representations of their Africanness. In both cases, these profound thinkers and performers came to terms with what African realities meant to them in their own individual way. In each case, developing manifestly utilitarian and contemporary visions of these multifarious actualities rather than reductive and stereotypical generalizations. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Aaron.
Sure.
So now it's Q&A. We have 10 minutes. Are there questions in the room or on Zoom? Please keep your questions very, very brief and straight to the point. Are there questions in the room? All right, Dr. Albert, please go ahead. Can you unmute?
Yeah, you have your microphone muted.
Okay. Yeah, thank you, Aaron, for that wonderful presentation. My question is, was Hugh Masekela able to stand out and remove himself from American jazz culture? Because from what I have been able to, assess from his music, I think he struggled all through to remove himself, from the Afro-American jazz culture. Do you think he was able to achieve that? Because at some point, Miles Davis also, encouraged him to break out and try to focus on his homeland. Do you think he was able to do that? Was able to achieve that?
Should I go ahead and answer that, Alba?
Yeah, sure.
Well, yeah, I think he won by giving up on that project, right? Like he didn't. I don't think eventually he wanted to give that up. I mean, he spent more than half of his professional career outside of South Africa, and he eventually produced a lot of different kinds of music. I wouldn't say everything he produced in the United States, even by a long shot, was pure jazz of the moment. I mean, he played with Herb Alpert, but Herb Alpert, speaking of commercial music, has always been one of the very commercial sides of jazz. I wouldn't say he was a hard bop or a bebop musician even, really. So and certainly when he eventually went back to Botswana, and when Mandela convinced him to go back to South Africa and start contributing to South African music, he wasn't playing standard American jazz. That being said, one of his last albums, or one of the last projects that he worked on, was a very large compilation of songs with an Afro-American pianist named Larry Willis, which is a great mixture of different songs. Some of them are South African, this medicine song that Bajabulo Bonke, is also a part of that, and that's one of the songs that he recorded and performed over and over again over the course of his career.
Mm.
So I wouldn't say that he succeeded in removing himself from American jazz. I think he always there was always a certain appreciation for African American jazz, which ran through a good part of his music. But you also look at his greatest hits like "Grazing in the Grass." I certainly wouldn't call that a standard jazz song. It's not. I mean, it's based on a riff, which is based on Sutu music. So I don't think I don't think that became even a viable objective for him. Eventually, he wanted to sort of balance the two things. If you look at his later concerts, also he had a tendency to go back and forth from different kinds of music in the course of his concerts. But oftentimes in his later tours, he had an African percussionist. I think it was a guy from Ghana, actually, and who was a big part of his performance. So I wouldn't say that he worked 100% within the jazz idiom ever, actually, once he started recording in the United States.
All right, thank you, Jan. Is there any question in the room in Lagos? Question from Lagos? All right, if there are none, is there a question? Okay, go ahead. Please give the gentleman microphone.
Thank you. Thank you for the presentation. I'm not certain, so I want to be sure if this is a comparison or parallelism, like putting them in parallels, or we're comparing Louis Armstrong and Hugh Masekela.
I started out as a comparatist. I actually got my PhD in comparative literature, but over the course of 2 decades of being an academic or more, I came across a concept which is called contrastive comparison, which is to say, we recognize that there are some similarities between these two figures. I mean, there's actually a lot of very compelling similarities. They both grew up in a time in their countries where they were suffering extreme racial oppression. I would say the United States, contrary to many discourses about democracy and racial equality, is one of the most intense sites of racial discrimination to the present day. And certainly apartheid South Africa represents another extreme example of that. Plus, they both grew up working within the jazz idiom, I mean, in different capacities. Louis Armstrong defined, to a certain extent, jazz. And they also became trumpeters and vocalists, which is a combination which is not very common. Usually people are either vocalists or they're trumpet players. There are some other examples, Chet Baker being an unfortunate example in American jazz. I would say he should have stuck to being a trumpet player rather than a vocalist, but there's a lot of compelling similarities between them. What I am not arguing, and what I tend to try to steer away from, even in orthodox comparative works, is saying that the things are the same. No, certainly they're not the same. And the richness of putting the two figures and their discourses and their music together, and what they say about Africa and Africanness and African authenticity, is precisely observing what is similar or relationable between the two of them, and also what is very different. Obviously, Louis Armstrong didn't grow up in Africa. He grew up in the south of the United States. So his experience was vastly different from Hugh Masekela's experience growing up in South Africa. Also, they produced different kinds of music. Louis Armstrong, all the way through his career, as I mentioned, for more than half a century, produced what's called hot jazz. And he never attempted really to move into cool jazz or bebop or hard bop or fusion jazz. That was not his thing. And he was not interested in doing that. He was heavily criticized by many musicians. He was even called an Uncle Tom and many other different things. Whereas Hugh Masekela was interested in eclecticism, if I can steal Dr. Robot's idea here. And he did combine a lot of other different kinds of elements from a lot of different places into his way that Louis Armstrong was not really interested in doing. So I'm going to sort of answer your question by saying it's neither nor. It's not saying they're totally different, and it's certainly not saying they're totally similar. It's what I call contrastive comparison, where we are putting these two things together side by side, or these two figures and their discourses, musical and otherwise. But it's not to say that they're the same. It's to show the ways that there are salient elements between the lives and work of both men, which can be related usefully, but certainly I'm not attempting to say that they are the same in any way. It's a rather long-winded
All right.
response.
Thank you, Aaron. We have a minute. I will just offer a quick follow-up question. You can offer a quick response. You deploy several terms throughout this presentation, Africanness, authenticity, Africanism, and I do wonder how you define those terms, especially authenticity. If you stick with the term authentic, are you thinking about that through a fixed perspective or through the idea that cultures evolve and that they are fluid?
Thanks very much for that. That's a good question, Alaba. Yeah, no, I'm using all of those terms. I wouldn't say ironically or sarcastically, but I'm using all of those terms in order to question those terms. First of all, and this is a question which I would imagine Dr. Robot is going to deal with in his own research. Who gets to define what is authentic? To say that Hugh Masekela's music, because it uses Western instrumentation or uses synthesizers or has lyrics in English, is not authentic. That's precisely what I cited this artist Mandlam Lageni, who I did a long interview with, and he became very annoyed when, not with me, but with the idea of artists who try to use their African ethnicity as a way of defining themselves or branding themselves, as he stated. So no, I'm not using autochthonous. I actually use the term autochthonous very specifically, which is an anthropological term. Okay, and I'm sure many people who are listening to me now have a heightened form of sensitivity to the fact that anthropology as a field emerged during the colonial project, both in Africa and many other places on the globe. Precisely all of this terminology and this way of approaching cultures on the verge of extinction, according to anthropologists, is very problematic. Okay, and trying to separate what is authentic African culture from things which are eclectic, once again to steal that term, is a very difficult, if not impossible, and dangerous project, I would say. There are certain things that, yes, people feel should be valued above or below other things.
Sorry, I have to interrupt. Can you round up, please?
Sure. So yes, no, I'm using those terms in order to question those terms, and especially the term traditional, right, which I always keep in parentheses. I never use the term traditional in any other way other than an ironic capacity. So, yes.
All right. Thank you so much. Now we'll move on to the final presentation.